The 2016 United States presidential election was pivotal in recent American history, largely because Donald Trump ignited a surge of populism across the country, a phenomenon not seen since the times of Richard Nixon. 8 years later, his influence remains significant as he seeks re-election in 2024. Trump and his Make America Great movement have become iconic in the ongoing battle between the common man and the elite establishment, or, as he refers to it, the deep state. His campaign is focused on returning power to ordinary citizens and breaking the grip of the deep state for good. Populism, the belief in the constant struggle between the common people and the wealthy elite, can manifest in different forms. The MAGA movement is just one example. Others include the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Civil Rights movement, and various revolutions and rebellions throughout history. Despite their ideological differences, these groups share a common belief that real change emerges from grassroots movements, where ordinary people rise up to reshape society by forcing the ruling elite to meet their demands. But the level of radicalism and the extent of their goals can vary significantly among these groups. History and revolutions have often been taught to us through a certain lens. The French Revolution was about people rising up against royal tyranny. The American Revolution saw colonists fighting for liberty against British rule, and the Russian Empire fell in 1917 when the working class could no longer tolerate oppression. This perspective paints revolutions as a classic struggle between the people and the ruling elite. But what if we've been getting it wrong, and this view only captures part of the story? This is what I and others call the populist delusion, which also happens to be the title of the book this video is based on. Make sure to check it out. I highly recommend it. The idea that societal and political change comes solely from grassroots movements where the common people rise up against the establishment to bring it down. As the saying goes, we are the 99%, they are the 1%. The harsh reality is that significant social change throughout history has often been driven not by the masses but by other elites at the top. When those in power want to reshape society, they deploy their vast resources and influence to create the appearance of widespread public support. They do this through legal frameworks, state-backed media, education systems, or corporate lobbying. For instance, movements like the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, various LGBT advocacy efforts, Black Lives Matter, Greta Thunberg's climate activism, and Extinction Rebellion may seem grassroots at first glance, but they often have backing and guidance from the existing power structure. The real struggle is between the ruling elite and the counter-elite. Revolutions occur when the existing ruling class loses the capability and motivation to stay in power, leading to widespread public discontent. This creates an opening for a counter-elite group to step in and take control. Rebellions happen, revolutions are engineered. What distinguishes this counter-elite group is its cohesive structure and strong discipline, enabling them to seize power when the current leadership falters. In contrast, popular uprisings without elite support, like the January 6th Capitol riot, the Yellow Vest protests, or the Canadian Freedom Convoy, are swiftly suppressed. That's the focus of today's video. I aim to show you that quote-unquote grassroots popular movements are mostly a myth. I want to reveal the truth about how power truly operates. It's rarely derived from democratic or popular sources. It's almost always in the hands of a well-organized minority, not the majority. This has been the reality since the beginning of society. Before we dive in, let me clarify that my point isn't that you are powerless and should simply accept your fate. I'm approaching power and politics from a realist perspective. If you want to change a country politically or socially, you can't do it with populist tactics. Change doesn't happen by convincing the most people to see things your way or by waiting for the masses to reach a tipping point and then overthrow the establishment. Change always requires concentrated strategic organization. Ultimately, power doesn't care how many likes your Twitter post received. The goal of this video is to expose and explain why the populist approach to changing society and politics is largely an illusion. This school of thought, which argues that change is driven from the top down rather than the bottom up, was championed by Gaetano Mosca, a key figure in Italian elite theory. In 1895, Mosca published his seminal work, The Ruling Class, which laid the groundwork for this perspective. So what better way to kick off this video than by delving into the ideas of the man who shaped this theory? Across all types of societies, whether they're in the early stages of development or highly sophisticated and powerful, one thing remains consistent. There are two classes of people. There's a class that rules and a class that is ruled. This is so obvious that even a casual glance can reveal it. But if it's so clear, why do we need to point it out? It's because we need to make it clear that the idea of popular sovereignty, that the people hold ultimate power, is inherently flawed. Because societies always have a ruling class and a ruled class, it's impossible for the people to be sovereign. Instead, power is always concentrated in the hands of a well-organized minority that leads and governs. As Mosca points out very clearly, quote, "In reality, the dominion of an organized minority obeying a single impulse over the unorganized majority is inevitable. The power of any minority is irresistible as against each single individual in the majority who stands alone before the totality of the organized minority. 100 men acting uniformly in concert with a common understanding will triumph over 1,000 men who are not in accord and can therefore be dealt with one by one. Meanwhile, it will be easier for the former to act in concert and have a mutual understanding simply because they are 100 and not 1,000. It follows that the larger the political community, the smaller will the proportion of the governing minority in the governed majority be, and the more difficult will it be for the majority to organize for reaction against the minority." This raises an intriguing question. Why does the majority put up with the rule of the minority? Disorganization aside, what's stopping them from overthrowing the minority, given that they vastly outnumber them? According to Mosca, it's because they accept the quote-unquote political formula of the ruling class. This political formula is the idea or belief that legitimizes the power of the rulers. Mosca offers two main examples of political formulas based on religious beliefs, like the divine right of kings, and those based on the concept of popular sovereignty or the will of the people. Or, better yet, we could call them ideologies. When there's a sense of moral unity between those in power and the people they govern, truly remarkable things can happen to a nation or movement. This unity can lead to the defeat of stronger enemies in war, consider the Viet Cong, the Taliban, and various so-called barbarian groups like the Franks who took on the Romans during the decline of their empire. However, this moral unity needs to be present not only among the people, but also within the ruling class. Even if the majority is united, they can still lose if their leaders lack cohesion. Mosca mentions the example of the Kingdom of Naples fighting the French in the late 18th century. Despite the people's unity, their pro-French leaders' betrayal undermined their chances of success. This kind of treachery can weaken resistance, disorganize the military, and dilute the power of popular resistance, which might otherwise have prevailed. The opposite can also occur if leaders are united but the people they govern don't share their vision. The ruling class is likely to fail. No ruling elite can maintain power without a political formula that resonates with those they lead. As German-American political scientist Hans Meisel points out in his book analyzing Mosca and the elite theory, quote, "Ruling classes may fail to adapt their formula to the changed demands of society, or ruling classes may renew themselves or be renewed. In the first case, failure to renew the formula may signal the end of the ruling class. In the second case, the formula might be retained. The British Crown would be a good example." Wait. If Mosca believed that a political formula creating unity between the ruled and the ruling class was so vital, why did he argue that the political concept of popular sovereignty, the power of the people, should be exposed as a lie? Doesn't this contradict his views? Academic Agent explains this very well in his book, which again is the backbone of this video. Quote, "First, Remember that Mosca's goal was not to instruct rulers in the art of politics, but rather to outline a science of politics which sees things in the cold light of day. Second, Mosca saw the political formula of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, as being entirely destructive because it is impossible to put into practice. The democratic principle is simply one wrong-headed offshoot of this. Mosca points out that the will of the people and the notion of divine right are both, in practice, taken on faith and are beyond reason. But the will of the people, unlike divine right, is the product of Enlightenment rationalism and is demonstrably false. This falsity has practical and often violent consequences which supernatural beliefs do not. But I would also like to add, while the unity between the ruled and the ruling class is important, and while the establishment could crumble due to the lack of support among the majority, it doesn't mean that the people are in power and will get their demands met. What actually happens in most cases is the counter-elite seizing their moment to take charge, all the while hijacking public discontent to legitimize their newfounded rule. That is why we keep hearing revolutionaries shouting that they are fighting in the name of the people, all the while their regimes, like France under Robespierre and Russia under Lenin, would do unspeakable atrocities in the name of the people, ironically, against the people themselves. It's this weird paradox. The ruling establishment cannot survive without at least some support from those they rule, but when their authority crumbles, it will just lead to a new elite stepping in to take their place, and whether that elite is actually fighting for the people or just taking advantage of the unrest is another story. So in the end, the only thing the people can do is show dissatisfaction and anger towards the establishment, which will just get taken advantage of by another elite seeking to overthrow the current one. No matter how you see it, the people aren't truly in power either way. Mosca didn't believe in a simple explanation for history, where one single thing is the reason everything happens. He thought that political ideas are important, but they're not the only thing that shapes history. Because of this, Mosca's view of how regimes change, the process of one ruling class taking over from another, is more complex and adaptable. Quote, "As soon as there is a shift in the balance of political forces, then the manner in which the ruling class is constituted changes also. If a new source of wealth develops in a society, if a practical importance of knowledge grows, if an old religion declines or a new one is born, if a new current of ideas spreads, then, simultaneously, far-reaching dislocations occur in the ruling class." Mosca believed that the main forces driving history are changes to quote-unquote social forces. These changes can come from shifts in economic conditions, new technology, or fresh ideas. By social forces, Mosca meant the key groups in society, like business people, farmers, intellectuals, and the military. If the ruling class can't adapt to these changes, they will be replaced by a new class that is better suited to lead in the new environment. This all sounds very cool and dandy, but this shouldn't apply to our modern system. This all sounds more like something about a feudal monarchy. Today we have democracy. The people are the ones actually in charge and picking their rulers. It is the whole reason why democracy developed, to actually give the people a right to choose where their country should be headed, and the old aristocratic system was abolished. Right? Right? When debating systems like monarchy versus democratic republic, Republicans often argue that democracy allows people to choose who leads their nation, highlighting the appeal of a system where harmful leaders can be voted out. This marks a shift from the old system of hereditary tyranny to one where power is ostensibly in the hands of the people. But how does Mosca's thesis apply to democracy? Has this system truly transformed, or have the elite simply adapted their methods of maintaining control? As previously mentioned, Mosca was highly skeptical about democracy and whether the people are truly empowered in it. He writes, quote, "What happens in other forms of government, namely that an organized minority imposes its will on the disorganized majority, happens also and to perfection whatever the appearances to the contrary, under the representative system. When we say that the voters quote-unquote choose the representative, we are using a language that is very inexact. The truth is that the representative has himself elected by the voters, and if that phrase should seem too inflexible and too harsh to fit some cases, we might qualify it by saying that his friends have him elected. In elections, as in all other manifestations of social life, those who have the will, and especially the moral, intellectual, and material means to force their will upon others, take the lead over the others and command them. These friends of elected officials tend to be rich individuals who can afford to fund politicians to advance their specific agendas, often at the expense of the broader public's interests. These wealthy figures often own newspapers and other media outlets, granting them the power to control the narrative and shape public opinion to their advantage. Furthermore, the candidates who run for office are often pre-selected by these same elites. Their campaigns are typically orchestrated by tight-knit groups that work to ensure that the election results align with their own goals. As a result, even though elections might appear democratic, the outcomes frequently reflect the wishes of those powerful minorities. According to Mosca, in the best-case scenario, democracy functions as an elected oligarchy. In another book, Political Elites by Gerard Perry, he writes in regards to this thesis, quote, "The elitist argument goes beyond the simple idea that a small group makes decisions while most people follow them. That's an obvious point that doesn't really explain how politics works. It's almost a given that fewer people make the rules while more people follow them. The elitist argument is much stronger. It states that when societies use democratic systems, the majority can never truly control the powerful minority. No matter how democratic things seem, the dominant minority always finds ways to stay in control and can't be held back by the majority." The reason why Mosca was not fond of democracy isn't that he wanted an autocracy where people did not have a say in how their country should be ruled, but rather that the structure has changed, but the fundamental dynamics of power have not. Elites continue to exert their influence, not through outright hereditary succession, but through political campaigns, media, lobbying, and other mechanisms that shape public perception and ensure their continued dominance. The key question is whether the democratic process truly empowers the people or simply gives the illusion of control while the elites maintain their grip on power. Patrick Deneen, in his seminal work Why Liberalism Failed, also points this out. Quote, "At its inception, liberalism promised to displace an old aristocracy in the name of liberty, yet as it eliminates every vestige of an old order, the heirs of their hopeful anti-aristocratic forebears regard its replacement as a new, perhaps even more pernicious, kind of aristocracy. This doesn't mean that elected officials can never challenge the existing establishment. Keep in mind that once they gain significant power, they become part of an elite, or, in some cases, a counter-elite. A classic example is the rise of Adolf Hitler. He wasn't born into privilege and experienced poverty, yet he climbed the ranks to become one of the most powerful leaders of his time. However, while his success in winning parliamentary seats through elections contributed to his rise, it wasn't a key factor. Remember, Hitler's appointment as chancellor was based on the belief that the ruling establishment could control him. Yet through cunning political strategy and a fair amount of luck, he outmaneuvered the elites, ultimately gaining the upper hand and reshaping the government according to his vision. The takeaway here is that political and societal change doesn't occur just because someone wins the most votes and takes office. The real battle begins after the election, when the new leader confronts the establishment to assert control. This is a high-stakes political game where the public has little influence over the outcome. Voting alone won't determine the winner. It comes down to the leader's skill, strategy, and often luck. In many cases, even those who gain power find themselves constrained by the existing elite. The German sociologist Robert Michels, who I am gonna go into detail up next, also shared this view. Quote, "For the will of the people is not transferable, nor even the will of the single individual. In actual fact, directly after the election is finished, the power of the masses over the delegate comes to an end." So regarding Michels, he is also an important figure in this discussion. Drawing directly from Mosca and a few others, he is the one who came up with the Iron Law of Oligarchy. The Iron Law of Oligarchy states that all forms of organization, regardless of how democratic they may be at the start, will eventually and inevitably develop oligarchic tendencies, thus making true democracy practically and theoretically impossible, especially in large groups and complex organizations. What makes Michels unique to Mosca is that he applies this rule to any form of organization, whether that would be large families, totems, tribes, cities, nations, and so forth. As he writes, quote, "Organization implies a tendency to oligarchy. In every organization, whether it be a political party, a professional union, or any other association of any kind, the aristocratic tendency manifests itself very clearly. As a result of organization, every part or professional union becomes divided into a minority of directors and a majority of directed. Who says organization says oligarchy." What does he mean by organization and oligarchy? An organization is a group of people working together in a structured way, with each person having a specific role. A part of this group is responsible for maintaining the structure or something very similar to it. Oligarchy is an organization where certain roles, usually those with the most power, often called leadership or executive roles, are not controlled by the rest of the group. This concept can be summed up as irresponsible leadership. It doesn't mean the leaders can ignore everyone else. They still need to consider how their actions will be received. But within the limits of the system, they have the freedom to do what they want. The Iron Law of Oligarchy provides a simple explanation for why the leftist takeover of American and European institutions since 1945 has been so successful. They didn't have to convince everyone or even the majority within organizations to agree with their views. They just had to take control of key leadership positions to push their agenda. Most university students aren't activists, they're generally uninterested. As Michels noted about young trade union members, quote, "They are heedless, their thoughts run in erotic channels. They are always hoping some miracle will deliver them from the need of passing their whole lives as simple wage earners." There are several practical reasons why the Iron Law of Oligarchy happens. There is the issue about mass and scale. Large, complex organizations, as opposed to smaller and simpler ones, tend to become more controlled by a few leaders due to technical and tactical reasons. The first reason is mechanical. When you have thousands or even millions of people, it's impossible to gather them all in one place. Even voting becomes a challenge with so many people. You have to narrow down their choices to a few main ones. Most people don't have the time or interest to constantly participate in voting or decision making. Michels, who observed the Social Democratic Party of Germany, noticed that, quote, "Committees set up to organize the day-to-day running of the party were systematically unattended. Because of this, the democratic principle has to give way to the oligarchical principle for practical reasons. However, even if we found a way to solve the problem with technology and crowdsourcing, there's still a technical issue. There are countless bureaucratic tasks that must be managed to keep the organization running. A political party aiming for power has to handle finances, administration, and diplomacy. It must also organize voting, canvass supporters, provide information to speakers, raise funds, and maintain its legal status." But the third reason is perhaps the most striking, beyond just technical reasons. It is that the masses simply will not and cannot organize. As Michels wrote, quote, "The most striking proof of the organic weakness of the mass is furnished by the way in which, when deprived of the leaders in time of action, they abandon the field of battle in disordered flight. They seem to have no power of instinctive reorganization, and are useless until new captains arise capable of replacing those that have been lost." In recent times, there is no better example than the infamous January 6th incident. When Donald Trump distanced himself from the mob, and without a clear leader, they became disorganized and started doing whatever, with no direction and purpose. There was no plan, no coordination, and no leadership. But what about direct democracy? All of these things could apply to representative democracy, but in a direct one, the people are the ones who directly choose legislation, rather than the representatives. Well, Michels also beautifully points out the inherent flaws of direct democracy as well, suggesting that it doesn't solve the main issue at hand here. Just a quick note, I have tweaked and reworded the following passages to be more simple and easily digestible, but the overall message and argument is still the same if you check out the work. It's just a little more simplified. Quote, "The system seems straightforward and effective at first glance, suggesting it would work smoothly. However, it might not meet its designers' expectations if actually implemented. The ideal of direct democracy is about the masses governing themselves based on decisions from popular assemblies. This system reduces reliance on representatives, but it doesn't prevent a small group from gaining too much power. It shifts the role of leaders directly to the people, yet the crowd can be easily swayed by skilled speakers. Also, because this kind of direct democracy doesn't allow for thorough discussions or careful consideration, it's easier for determined and clever individuals to quickly seize control or influence outcomes. Dominating a large crowd is easier than influencing a small group. A crowd quickly and completely aligns with ideas once swayed, and it strongly resists opposition from a few people or an individual. Large groups gathered closely together are more prone to sudden fears, unthinking excitement, and similar reactions than smaller groups where members can calmly discuss and reflect on issues. It's a common observation that large public meetings often approve proposals with loud approval or unanimous agreement, whereas if the same gatherings were divided into smaller groups of about 50 people, the decisions would be more cautiously made. At major party conventions attended by key members, actions and words tend not to be considered as carefully as they would be by individuals or small groups within these large gatherings. The individual often gets lost in the crowd, losing personal identity and sense of responsibility. This phenomenon highlights a significant issue with the idea of mass sovereignty. Not only does it show the problematic nature of crowd behavior, but it also points to the practical challenges of implementing direct democracy on a large scale. The Iron Law of Oligarchy is what nails the last nail in the coffin of populism. If populism sticks true to itself, where the masses collectively work together to topple the elite, they are gonna fail miserably with no progress made. But if a leadership emerges that is an oligarchy to lead the revolt against the elites, then you are already back at square one, because you have a minority that rules and leads and a majority that follows. Because of this very simple concept, true populism is quite literally impossible. So if this is the case, then what can we do to change it? The answer is, you can't. Hierarchies are natural in every human society. True collective leadership, where every person has the same amount of power, is just a fairy tale. As I have established in the video, governments by the people and of the people simply do not exist. But that does not mean that governments for the people are impossible. Just because there is a hierarchy, just because the circulation of elites and those well-off is inevitable, it doesn't mean that they inherently want to keep the people down and miserable. History has shown that there were numerous instances where kings, nobles, presidents, politicians, and so forth tried their best to empower the little man and frequently squabbled with other elites. A notable example is the 16th century German Peasants' War. It is considered the biggest popular revolt before the French Revolution, with peasants fighting for their rights to bring down noble tyranny. And yet the peasant leadership wasn't compromised of commoners, but preachers like Thomas Müntzer and noblemen like Florian Gaia. Again, the instance of the counter-elite. In fact, if you look at more examples throughout history, monarchs have more or less sided more with commoners and the lower classes against the aristocracy. The conflict has almost always been between aristocrats and monarchs. Remember, the Magna Carta wasn't championed by the peasants, but aristocrats seeking to limit the power of the king and boost their own autonomy. Eric von Levin also points this out in his book, Menace of the Herd. Quote, There is no doubt that a republic is the ideal form of government for an aristocracy which wants to rule directly instead of serving a ruler has practically only the choice between an ephemeral monarchy of the English type or a downright republic after the pattern of Venice, Genoa, or early Florence. Monarchy was historically always the best protection against any sort of oligarchical rule, and it was the historic role of monarchs to side with the lower classes against the nobility. And in my opinion, our focus shouldn't be to topple the elite and give power into the hands of the people or whatever, but rather the focus should be to change the ruling elite in favor of another one. Elections, as I have showcased, don't guarantee that this change in leadership actually happens. They don't decide anything. If anything, it just makes controlling the majority easier for the establishment by giving them an illusion of choice, which just entrenches their grip further. In a monarchy, for example, you know very well who rules and who has the power, which is the king, and you also know who the noblemen are. And when the ruling elite starts losing their grip on power, blood is gonna be spilled and heads are gonna start rolling. For this reason, they have to be much more careful when ruling, because that target is not going to be taken off their backs. But in a democratic republic, you don't know who is actually pulling the strings behind the scenes. The elected official is merely the face of the nation. It doesn't guarantee that he is actually in charge. If you believe today that Joe Biden is the one actually in charge and has power, you probably need to get your brain checked. And when the ruling elite starts faltering, they can very easily shift the blame on the elected official and get the people to vote him out. The people think the problems are over, and the elite just has to start influencing the next guy that comes into office. Nevertheless, my points stand clear. Populism is nothing more than a myth. A lie propagated to make the people think they are the ones who are in charge, or could be in charge. Remember, Donald Trump isn't the average Joe. He is a billionaire with a lot of influence and connections. And when actual grassroots popular movements spring up, they fall apart completely. Hierarchies are good and natural, and there is nothing we can do to change that.